Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights here with Charlie Araujo. And how are you today?
I am fabulous. It is an amazingly gorgeous day. I almost canceled the podcast so I could just be outside here in New York. It is absolutely insane. And, after the long, cold winter, we always are excited when we get these first hints of spring, but no time to go play in the sun because there is so much news out right now. It is just crazy what's going on for the enterprise tech. And again, validation that if you're a CIO, you've got a whole lot on your plate. So lots to talk about.
Ironically, as New York City is looking beautiful, the stock market is in uh, arrears. The less said about that, the better, other than to say that tech, of course, has been affected as well. So we all took a little bit of a haircut today.
Yeah, it is definitely a tumultuous time. I think it's a I think I think we're gonna I don't know if we'll be long enough to in the tooth to look back at this, but at some point other people will look back at this period as I think one of the pivotal points in history where there was just so much going on and as a result of I think so much volatility. And our lead stories today are actually really bring that to a point. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
jokingly that we talk about AI, that this is really about the AI show. But yeah, I guess we could also say it's always about Salesforce and ServiceNow because, hey, we talk about enterprise tech and they're a
Mhm.
couple to 800-pound gorillas. And this week is no exception. So we have actually a whole host of stories, in part because Salesforce led with a bunch of news. And they announced two things, and I don't know if you were at the announcement or not, but two things that they introduced. One is what they're calling 2DX because 2.0 apparently maybe they explained why they decided to call it 2DX instead of 2.0, but basically their new release of Agentforce. And with that, they also released what they're calling the AgentExchange, which is a marketplace basically for agents. But I do think they have an interesting twist on it that is going to be interesting. So, were you there? And if you want to tee it up for us, if you were.
Yes, I was. So the idea of Agentforce 2DX, this is basically a 2.5 launch, but it was very much focused on the developers and it's at the Trailblazer conference, thus kind of a developer experience, developer edition type D based branding. And I thought it was interesting because they've announced a few things that you would expect from a developer perspective, such as better defined API, which is not super exciting, but definitely table stakes. There's better testing abilities for agents. There's better visibility for basic for things that have been invoked, as well as for interaction and interaction explorer, which is a little step towards visibility and ongoing kind of understanding the performance of the agent. So there's a lot of these little bits and pieces that are here about inspecting and exploring the performance of the agent as well. And that's really what I thought the meat of the Agentforce announcement was this time around.
I do think it's interesting. I mean, it clearly doubles down and I think solidifies what I've been talking about for a while. And that is that Agentforce is really a build your platform, and that is clearly the direction they're going. And I think Salesforce for a while has been sort of having a foot in both camps. Clearly, their roots with the CRM was definitely not that sort of developer focus, although they had um, uh, Remedy Force, right, which was sort of a developer platform on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then they have things like MuleSoft, which clearly gets us much closer to the developer ecosystem. So, no surprises in my mind. I think all the right sort of things that they need to be doing in order to go down that road, if that's the bet they're making on this developer platform. And I think that's also related to the agent exchange, in that it's really about this idea of how do they then start taking this developer centric viewpoint and extrapolate it with their partner community and their ecosystem so that there's effectively this marketplace of building blocks to work from. So, I think it's interesting. I think I don't particularly find a marketplace all that shocking or innovative, but it's sort of a necessary thing. And I do think they're showing a lot of good partners with that. And I think that's interesting from the standpoint of, is this going to hit this sort of middle ground where they can sort of strike this balance. So I think overall it's a solid announcement. They're clearly moving at a breakneck pace, which is impressive for an organization of this size. I do think it's also interesting in light of what we talked about last week, with the fact that clearly this doesn't seem to be having a tremendous amount of impact on their financial results presently. So it is kind of curious to see how this all sort of comes together, and if these are massive investments they're making if they're going to actually play out.
Yes, and I think these are actually kind of related challenges. That this version of Agentforce was very much focused on, I would say, IT and developer centric desires, administrative needs, and that's needed because if you want to get to 100 agents or 1,000 agents, you need some sort of control plane to be able to manage all of this and to deal with observability issues and performance issues and testing issues. And I think that's one of the reasons that Salesforce is going in this direction. They realize that if they really do want this to be a billion-dollar business, there needs to be the IT and scaling tools to make agents work. And frankly, Salesforce doesn't have them, and they're not really that common in the marketplace as a whole. There's no real third party that is, say, like Informatica for data integration or Tableau for BI or something like that, a third party that can take care of all this stuff. So Salesforce is building their own suite, as are some other big players. And it's really interesting to watch because I feel like one of the big picture things that's happening is that this new set of IT tooling is being built by the platform players for a change. Because I cover a lot of other IT management spaces where there's these separate tools that manage IT or manage IT observability or management. And in this case, Salesforce itself is just saying, we're just going to build it from the get-go.
Well, it is interesting. I think it's a risk for Salesforce. They don't have a great track record in this space in terms of selling. I mean, they obviously sell to a CIO, but in terms of selling at this level, and so that'll be the curious thing. And then, I think you're right. It's also we're gonna close the show today talking about why this is a significant concern for CIOs in general. But it also, I think, is indicative of the fact that we're really seeing like these three major competitors emerge in this space, sort of duking it out. Literally, I can almost envision, like, I don't know if there's such a thing where three fighters are in a ring all together, but where these three fighters and they're just literally just standing still. They're not bobbing and weaving. They're just sitting and pounding on each other. And one of those is, of course, Microsoft, but the other is ServiceNow. And ServiceNow, I think this is interesting from a couple of standpoints. When they introduced their Agentic AI platform a couple of weeks ago, it was very clear they were trying to go after this control plane that you're talking about, right? And I don't know that they sold me on it from the perspective of how they positioned it, but clearly that's where they were going. And there's a couple other interesting aspects to this, because ServiceNow has also gone hardcore after the CRM business, which of course is Salesforce's bread and butter. And in retaliation, I guess, maybe taking a play from the tariff fights going on in the global economy right now, our friend Bob Evans is reporting that he picked up a tidbit. I think he's taking this from the earnings call, the same one that I talked about last week. But in either case, reporting that Benioff is hinting at an upcoming ITSM product that Salesforce would be releasing. And if that's true, would clearly be targeting ServiceNow's core business. Now, I can't find any other reference to this anywhere other than what Bob was reporting. So I'm not sure. But I just do think it is quite fascinating to just see, particularly these three, all big giant companies, all just sitting there, just duking it out. So I'm curious if you've heard any scuttlebutt around Salesforce going after the ITSM business, which I would actually find quite surprising. They've clearly made a couple of runs at that in the past, or at least hinting at it with a partnership with BMC a long time ago. But most people view ITSM as sort of a stagnating space, and so I'm curious if you've heard anything and what your take is.
Yeah, I feel like the agentic tooling that Agentforce hinted at with this 2DX release is a little like baby steps towards the IT SM space. I can definitely see how some of these aspects of looking at how an agent is built, how an agent is documented, how the agent is working along with people and being tracked on an interaction specific basis, how all of that can be seen as a little piece of the ITSM puzzle. It definitely does not take over for IT service management the way that ServiceNow or any other mature service management platform does it at this time. But I think this is a little hint that Salesforce understands it needs to be an IT tooling company if it's going to make agents work. And frankly, I think that is part of the real opportunity here. I look at a lot of the uh, optimization and service order tracking that I used to do, but as an IT analyst 15, 20 years ago. And it was all crap work, frankly. I never wanted to do it. I wanted something automated to have the judgment to be able to do a lot of this stuff, but we just didn't have the technology then. And I think that's where Salesforce is pointing at next, and where ServiceNow is going to have to protect some of its ground, and not just from Salesforce, but from other agentic players. That you could look at Boomi. I'm sure SAP with LeanIX is going to do something in that space. People are going to come after ServiceNow's lunch in this more automated agentic management space.
So it's a little bit like a game of capture the flag. As they're trying to get out and go after the other one, they need to be worried about protecting their base. Well, we'll
Mm-hmm.
see. I think it is interesting. So speaking of ServiceNow, some other big news just breaking. Well, I'm not clear. I've heard competing stories about whether or not this is confirmed, but it appears that ServiceNow is announcing a deal to acquire Moveworks for
Mm-hmm.
$2.85 billion, I believe, and not insignificant. Moveworks made some news. They've been a venture funded company targeting, frankly, ServiceNow, their AI play. So they're an agentic AI platform of sorts, I guess, or an AI platform trying to automate really on top of ServiceNow. That is really their core go to market. Full disclosure, they're definitely a competitor with what we're doing at Symphony AI. And so this is definitely great news, I think, for Moveworks.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime you see a big acquisition like that, that's always great for the investors and the employees of the acquired company. I do think it actually speaks a little bit to ServiceNow's maybe not being quite as advanced as they were claiming to be. I mean, they made their big announcement that their agentic AI platform just a few weeks ago, and then here effectively acquiring the company that seemed very clear like they were one of the reasons they were targeting them. So I think it's interesting. I do think it's a good move for ServiceNow in that I think that Moveworks had proven to be very adept at orchestrating and executing against ServiceNow workflows. And so I think it's going to give them a huge leg up on that side of it. So we will definitely see, and I think the question is always in this case how well they do. I think ServiceNow is one of the better ones at how they manage acquisitions. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's going to bode well for this. But definitely very interesting and, in my opinion, shocking news. I did not see this one coming.
Yeah, I think this is a good acquisition for ServiceNow in that agent orchestration across solutions and across platforms is obviously a huge battleground. I am a little concerned in that I feel like Moveworks' real advantage over ServiceNow in this regard is front end related, and it speaks to kind of the challenge of ServiceNow as a front end platform. Frankly, it's a little sloppy. It's a little old when you look at ServiceNow's default front end capabilities. And that is something that they are probably going to be pushed on to a greater degree over the next year or two as they have to fight off competitors, both in the agentic space and in traditional ITSM, where other companies are just going to come out with solutions that are easier to use and administrate.
Well, and they're not going to talk about it, but one of Moveworks' primary motions here was they're simply cheaper than ServiceNow, that you
Mm-hmm.
accomplish this sort of agentic or at least AI powered workflow and automation without having to pay the premium that ServiceNow was charging. And so, of course, if they acquire them, what does that do to that particular motion? So, it's going to be, is this could be an acquire and kill type motion, just decide they had enough of these guys and, do some acqui-hire. So it'll be really interesting to see how that one plays out. On the topic of agentic AI, though, I think that there was in my opinion, what may be a very huge announcement. Again, sort of in the vein of DeepSeek, too early to tell, but another Chinese company, this one called Manus, has come to market and released what they're calling, I think it's just called Manus AI, or just Manus maybe, and it is a fully autonomous generic agentic AI platform. And what I mean by that is, unlike certainly what we're developing, or unlike other companies where they tend to be focused on specific things, and unlike a builder platform like a Salesforce or what ServiceNow is doing, this is effectively, think about the same way you would use GPT or Claude, and where you just have this thing, except that now this thing can literally go and on its own do just a huge rush. So in the demo that they're showing, and so far, as far as I know, it's still just a demo, like nobody's actually been able to get their hands on it really. But in the demo, it says, I'm interested in renting an apartment or buying a place in San Francisco or something like that, with a little bit of parameters, the same kind of prompt that you might give into a ChatGPT. And instead of giving the sort of normal, pretty short, concise little response that you would get and say, here's some considerations, or here's a look at, or whatever, this thing went out and on its own, without it being prompted, looked at crime rates, looked at resale values, looked at all this sort of stuff, and did this really deep dive and prepared this really deep report. And I think what was really interesting about it was that it was the lack of prompting, or the way I would think of it is like at a manager, like, oh, this agent really showed initiative, right? They went out there and thought, what was the subtext behind this request, and sort of dug into it on its own. It was very impressive. Again, on the demo, it seemed very fast. If I compare it to some of the other chain of thought reasoning models. So we'll see. We'll see if when this really gets out into the wild, if it is as impressive as it looks. But on the demo, it looks like this is a significant breakthrough.
Yeah, and I find it fascinating from kind of a philosophical perspective, in that I feel like American AI has been very focused on scale out, just create as much big of an AI as you possibly can, throw as much data as possible, and see what comes out of it. And the Chinese AI innovations that we've seen are about creating guardrails to some extent. So with DeepSeek, we saw restricted processing used to create the same level of AI, because they were just smarter about how they went into kind of that assembly level and figured out how to make the model more efficient. And now with Manus, it seems like when you give it an instruction, it quickly figures out what are the rules that we need to figure out, and then starts optimizing those rules. Kind of reminds me of some of these old school AIs that learned how to optimize how to play Pac-Man, or optimized how to play chess. You gave them some rules, and then it figured out how to absolutely optimize to those rules. And this is a little more complicated than that. That Manus first has to figure out what the rules are, but it quickly figures out what is the task. And then it figures out how to optimize based for that task, but at a pretty general level. I'm sure that there are things that break down at the ends, at the extremes, but this seems like a really interesting way to create an agent that is productive. And it wasn't done by thinking bigger, but probably by thinking about how to restrict the AI's focus. That's my guess here.
Well, and what I thought was interesting in the demo, the co-founder and chief scientist, I'm not going to try to say his name, Peak, I guess he goes by. He came across as very articulate, and what I mean by that is, like, this wasn't just geek speak. This wasn't just how can we create some cool technology. It was very much focused on how do we solve problems and actually create something that delivers a result, a solution. And I was very impressed by it. I mean, I think, like I said, we will see what this thing looks like in the wild when people can start putting it through the paces. But on first blush, it was quite impressive.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
let's see some additional. We'll do a little drive by. There was, like I said, a whole bunch of news. I'll queue them all up actually here, and you can dive in where you feel like makes sense. So, what was some of the other big news this week? Anthropic raises another $3.5 billion. Cursor, which is a AI coding tool, raises another. Forgot how much here. Um, well, where I've lost how much they raised, but anyway, at a $10 billion valuation. So doing quite well on that front. LlamaIndex came to market talking about some unstructured data agents, which is a little bit interesting. And I'm going to go in reverse order because for me, I thought this was the most interesting. CoreWeave announced the acquisition of Weights and Biases, which is a company that
Yes.
most people have not heard of. But what's interesting is, of course, CoreWeave is an AI hyperscaler, and Weights and Biases is basically an AI development platform. I guess you call it an AI IDE, sort of. Um, and I think this is really, really interesting as we've talked about in the past and all of these are sort of reflective of this, of the
Mhm.
worlds of AI merging as we are increasingly moving towards operationalization and bringing all it together. So, I mean, just that was sort of this drive by of all of the other industry news. But what was your take on any of this?
Yeah, so let's start with CoreWeave and Weights and Biases, which is actually kind of two separate stories. That CoreWeave itself is actually getting ready for an IPO of its own as an AI hyperscaler. The S1 very interestingly said that their over half of their business comes solely from Microsoft at this point. So they are very top heavy with their revenue and have to show that they have a future that is not just dependent on supporting Microsoft AI. And this was actually this acquisition of Weights and Biases was actually a fantastic way to do it. Weights and Biases is well known in the data science and machine learning world as an environment for creating AI applications. They've done a fantastic job of executing on that and creating their own $1 billion plus valuation company supporting this use case. And I think it's a smart way to for this hyperscaler, best known probably as an aggregator of processing, to also bring the smarts of Weights and Biases. And I know a bunch of people in the Weights and Biases team. They previously used to be in analytic use cases and BI use cases. So this is kind of not their first rodeo in scaling up something. You know, they used to work at companies like Alteryx and Tableau and other big companies that have also become $1 billion companies supporting data. So you know, this was obviously a next step. Congratulations to everybody involved on making lots of money.
Well, and I think it's the sort of continuing thing we've seen NVIDIA make some similar moves where we're just increasingly seeing hardware and software merge and come together because we're recognizing that in order to truly operationalize all this, you have to deal with both sides of it. You need the infrastructure, but you also need to be building these apps. And one of the things that is interesting about Weights and Biases is that they're focused, yes, on model building, but they're also focused on this AI app layer and providing a tool set to do that. So I think it provides a nice counterbalance, and I think it's going to be really interesting. The other story of all of these that I was interested in was the Anthropic. Not, I mean, you know, them getting a bunch of money isn't all that newsworthy in and of itself. They're all one of the darlings in the AI space, but I think they're sort of the hidden, right. The OpenAI gets all the news for the most part. I mean, they're the ones everyone talks about. And
Mhm.
I think I'm increasingly becoming more and more bullish on Anthropic for two reasons. One, as someone who uses both Claude and ChatGPT all the time, I find myself gravitating towards Claude because I find its answers to be much more conversational, much more human like. I mean, whatever. It's like it just feels like it does a better job. And so I think that they are quietly not on necessarily the benchmarks, right? I think they do find the benchmarks, but as we've talked about, it's less about benchmarks and more about the feel, right? How does this execute?
Mhm.
And I think they're actually quietly doing a really good job of continuing to level up that element of it. But I also like their business model. I just think what's interesting, if you look at the user counts, it looks like OpenAI is just running away with this. But if you look at revenue, while OpenAI is still larger, Anthropic is doing quite well. I mean,
Mhm.
and there's a massive disconnect between those two. And what that speaks to is that Anthropic is doing a much better job of leveraging up and building a sustainable business model that isn't driven by this massive amount of free traffic while they have
Yep.
that. And that's really important because if anything is going to really affect OpenAI in the long run, I think it's going to be their burn rate. And so I think Anthropic is being very smart in how they approach it. And so I was glad to see this because I think it's very important for them to be in this fight.
Yeah, I think Anthropic has been doing a fantastic job, especially recently with Claude Sonnet 3.7 and Claude Code. I've been hearing from a bunch of people who I talk to, saying these models have been doing just a really good job. Anthropic has not lost their focus in improving AI capabilities, even in with the threat of DeepSeek and obviously Alibaba and Tencent and the Chinese AI. And it feels like in that light, OpenAI's response is to say that we just have to get bigger. We have to create data centers. We need to get funding from SoftBank. We need billions of dollars to be poured into hardware. Whereas Anthropic is still saying, no, there's still a lot of work to do in this AI space. And it's not just about creating this artificial general intelligence. There, we can take more discrete and detailed steps into making AI better and to creating general use agents and perhaps following along with Manus and doing their own version of that. I would not be surprised at all to see Anthropic launch something like that in the near future because they are still developing these tools that are incrementally better and supporting specific use cases to it more usefully than other companies are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's, it is an interesting and challenging space, and it's always difficult to sort of sort everything out. I think of the other news, the Cursor one, my only real big take on Cursor is that I am a little bit shocked by the valuation.
Mm-hmm.
It's an incredibly high valuation for a company that, in the grand scheme of things, is not. I mean, it's doing like 150 million in ARR, which is nothing to sneeze at, but it's also. I mean, that represents a valuation of, I think, according to TechCrunch, 66 times ARR. That's a massive, massive valuation uplift,
Yes,
and I
and
think we might
that's
be seeing a little bit of. Go ahead.
yeah. It's just that that's coming right after their competitor Codium raised at 70 times ARR. I think there's this assumption that these coding assistants are just going to provide such massive value and take out armies of developers and be seen as this just as just a quantum shift in the developing world.
It's ironic because, of course, this is AI going after tech employees, which are notoriously expensive and
Mhm.
so and hard to come by. And so I think that's all why. I do wonder though, and what I was about to say is if it represents a little bit of a bubble in that while I understand the benefit and everyone pretty much acknowledged that
Mhm.
this is the initial killer use case for it. I do wonder if these valuations are really going to be sustainable. So anyway, just another interesting data point. Is there anything you wanted to add on LlamaIndex before we moved on?
No, I think the interesting one for me around the interesting topic for me around the LlamaIndex announcement is simply that we're starting to see agents look at unstructured data to a greater extent. LlamaIndex is not huge yet, but I think there is going to be this challenge of trying to figure out what do we do with these pictures, these videos. Is there a way for us to be able to turn these types of instructions into deeper agents over time? And it just to show that everything is being agentified. But behind the hype of just simply saying that word over and over again, this means we are seeing agents being created to support structured data, to support all of our processes, basically replacing robotic process automation over time, and then also supporting unstructured data.
As we're going to finish here in a minute, brings back to issue the challenge with this proliferation of agents and the management headache that represents. All right. Well, as we always try to do, we try to finish on topics that are near and dear to the CIO's heart and the things that need to really be aware of. And so we have a handful of these as well. We'll sort of run through them again, sort of quickly. But the first is HPE announced a impacted outlook, and this is important mostly because they are blaming it on the threat of the tariffs and the big hiccup here, and it's not exclusive to HPE, although I think these are the ones that they're the first company to do a major um, uh, guidance update around it.
Right.
But I think it does represent, I think if you're a CIO, you need to be actually very concerned, particularly because a lot of CIOs still do maintain data centers, whether directly on-prem or in colos, where they're actually buying servers directly. So this is no longer just big giant data center stuff. Now we're talking about all the way down at the server and potentially even the PC level. So definitely a potential impact there.
Yeah, and HPE took the hit, something like a 20% hit to their valuation, and that reflects what they see as their near-term future from a revenue perspective. It is hard to overestimate the importance of Mexican operations on U.S. hardware companies. Every U.S. hardware company uses Mexican labor. It's no secret that border is something that you pass over all the time if you're in semiconductors to any extent, and any sort of tariffs are going to affect American servers, and that's what HPE is dealing with.
So on a related note, there's also the potential direct impact from, and this is actually driven by you CIOs, but there we saw the IT unemployment rate jump. And what's interesting, this is coming from an article from CIO Dive. This is specifically looking at CIO hiring. So this isn't just the broader tech sector, but specifically within IT organizations. And I find this a little bit fascinating because on the one hand, I think it's reflective of the fear that we're seeing this. I don't know about you, I'm seeing this across the board, and almost everyone I talk to, there is a concern about the uncertainty. We've talked about this in the past. The Trump administration seems to have ushered in this era of uncertainty in the market, and therefore everyone is sort of hunkering down a little bit. And it seems to be reflected in this latest jobs report that we are seeing some of these numbers edge up, and that's mostly because we're seeing a little bit of hiring stagnation, that companies are slowing down and taking a wait and see approach around it. I also think it's reflective, and it's interesting in this data, and this is the part that for me is sort of like there's this dissonance, is there's also a gap, right? In that we're seeing the impact particularly on more traditional IT type roles, whereas if you have AI expertise, there are jobs all over the place because people are trying to backfill in these more advanced roles, and they're having trouble finding those people. And so just these sort of interesting conflicting points.
Yeah, and part of me says to be contrarian. Anytime you're seeing IT unemployment, it's a great time to hire talent. This is a good time to look at your team and figure out where you've wanted to fill in gaps for a while, but maybe we're not as excited to do. And this is a time to actually go after those areas. Could be as boring as getting more Java developers, or as interesting as hyping up your AI operations. But there's more talent out there than there typically has been. And take advantage of that, because it is a combination of the volatility that we have economically and politically. I also think that CEOs are trying to crack down a little bit on hiring and control both the quality and volume of the people coming in. There was some overhiring going on prior to this year, no doubt, with tech companies expecting to grow 30% forever, which was never something that you could bet on or rely on. Honestly, the economy grows more like 10% a year, and that's where hiring growth should normally be. If you're growing 25-30%, there's always going to be some point where you have to stop doing that. But I do think this is a good time to look for talent, because there are more people out there looking for jobs than there typically would have been.
Yeah, and I think, as we talked about, what story that we decided to skip was the fact that, we're still seeing things like Kubernetes cost overruns, and then we're going to talk right now about cybersecurity, my least favorite topic. But the
Yeah.
reality is this is still our reality in the CIO suite or within IT organizations is that it's all the blocking and tackling. And so if you can pick up good talent that can multiply that and give you an exponential factor, then you're going to be well served. So, all right, well,
Mhm.
talking about cybersecurity, because I actually had to cover security for like 2 years and hated it. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but it's zero sum and it's mind boggling. But this particular story I did find interesting, mostly because it talks about the fact that one of the big shifts. So we reported a couple weeks ago about a decrease in ransomware payouts, but there's always this ongoing battle when you're talking about cyber criminals. And the shift here is that as that has happened, they have retargeted a little bit by going after what are being called, correct me if I'm wrong, third party attacks, right? Or targeting
Mhm.
third parties. And what this really means is that you are using somebody's software, you're a CIO, you acquire somebody's software, and it's not that you're being breached directly, it's that this third party that you're using is being breached somewhere upstream, and that creates a backdoor or an opening where you then now have a vulnerability and can be held hostage, or have a ransomware attack against you. And that's notoriously difficult because you actually don't have control in many cases over that to the necessary degree to actually thwart an attack. So it's particularly challenging. And of course, for if you're a cyber criminal, that means that I've got a bigger attack plane. I can now get much more value from my my attack money, so to speak. So
Mhm.
it was a little bit interesting.
Yes, I agree with you that cybersecurity is not fun to cover. Uh, but that said, uh, this is pretty obvious that looking that there's an increased focus on vendors and cyber attack capabilities continue to scale up and get more nuanced and more complex year after year. So that's definitely something to look out for. I would even suggest going out to your key software vendors and asking what exists in your contracts to protect you against cybersecurity ransomware issues, as well as what kinds of BCDR your vendors have in place, because they are being targeted to a greater extent. It's not any sort of secret that there are also countries that are very involved in cybersecurity and ransomware attacks. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. All are basically companies that are enemies to us at the United States, let's just say, and trying to get it or rivals in one shape, way or another, and trying to get into our systems. And without going into too much detail there, let's just say, we've all seen there are layoffs happening in the government. We are relaxing some of our policies towards some of these countries. Uh, but I don't think that's going to change the fact that they still want our money and they are still going to attack our software companies to get that money. So uh, be careful and perhaps put a little extra attention there this year.
Well, and I think it also speaks to what I would probably call the greatest challenge facing the CIO today. And that is, so that manifests in the form of the security that we just talked about, but it's really much broader than that. And that is the fact that if you are operating an IT organization today, if you're running it, you are fundamentally beholden to this massive network of suppliers that are providing all this technology. Most of it's now cloud-based. Most of it has connections to the outside world, and most of it you do not directly control. And that represents lots and lots of challenges. Everything from the cloud costs, that the story we didn't talk about, Kubernetes
Mhm.
overruns, but also things like we've hinted to several times today during today's show about managing AI agents. And this is going to be, I think, incredibly complex, because it's easy for a ServiceNow or Salesforce to talk about, oh, we've got this tool and provide you this control plane. But the reality is that AI agents are unlike almost any other type of technology that you are deploying into the tech stack, because of the degree of autonomy, because of the ambiguity of what it even means to be an AI agent, because
Mhm.
of the complete lack of any sort of industry standards about how we're reporting. There's no requirement or no established protocol for an AI agent within a technology ecosystem to self-report it, to self-report to say I'm here and this is what I'm doing. None of that. And so I think there's this really interesting article in CIO. I've been sort of negative or critical of CIO articles often because of CIO.com articles, because I feel like they're sort of fluffy. But this one I thought really did a great job of addressing the challenge and talking to a bunch of CIOs in this article about both the promise and the challenge that comes with it. And to your point earlier in the show, nobody really has an answer to this. Nobody, I mean, I haven't heard anybody even in market talking about that they are even attempting to address this problem. And I think in part it's the industry is still very nascent. And so that's, that's part of the reason. But this is going to be a significant challenge. And I think it's, we may be years away from having solutions that actually bring all this together. And I think as a CIO, it's going to be quite a significant challenge to get your head around all of this.
Yes, the AI agent management challenge I find really interesting because I have been tracking IT management challenges my entire analyst career. I started with looking at telecom expense management, where I was looking mostly at network and landline phone endpoints. So that's how long ago I started doing this stuff. I looked at cell phones and smartphones for mobility expense management, wireless expense management. I looked at SaaS management, both from an performance perspective as well as from a cost perspective. I've looked at cloud FinOps, and as we've looked at cloud observability and financial issues. And of course, there are contractual issues that go along with this. And now I see IT agent management as being this next stage. And it's going to be difficult because we have so many different levels of performance management that we're looking at, everything from transactional activity to the agents themselves and how the agents are governed in a variety of ways, what the security is, what the actual inventory of the agents are, which agents go along with which platforms, the actual, as well as the cost structure associated with aligning agents to hardware and from a storage and compute perspective, and whether what is being containerized, what is being what is being directly supported. This is going to be a hot mess, quite frankly, and it's at multiple levels support.
Well, and what I do think is really interesting, and this is why I say it is unlike any other technology, because historically we would have these sort of abstracted components where you have the infrastructure layer, you have the middleware layer, you have the application layer, you have the experiential layer, whatever. And you could instrument effectively each of those independently. And we've, over the years, we've been trying to look more end to end, more full stack capabilities. But the reality is they were still sort of these distinct components. And when you talk about an agent, you have to look at it, really all of it. You've got the sort of the observability aspects where you have to be able to trace it and understand what systems it's connecting, where it's getting data from, et cetera. But then you have the experiential, right? What we would historically would have called the digital experience platform or management platform, to be able to understand not only is it performing, but is it delivering the right information, and is it taking actions that we think are appropriate? And now you got this entire subjective layer. I mean, it's going to be super, super challenging, particularly, and this is why I've been, somewhat bearish on the whole builder platform approach, is that particularly if I'm unleashing this by giving, thousands and thousands of employees the ability to go and create these random agents and throw them out into the world, where now you don't even have a control mechanism that I'm using to do it in a central fashion. I think it's going to be, quite a challenge. And what I appreciate with this article is it doesn't pretend that it has an answer. I think there is no answer right now. But it's at least shooting the flare to say, hey, this needs to at least be on radar, and you need to start thinking about how you're going to do it, even if it's solely within the specific ecosystems that you're deploying it with as a starting point. And this is where ServiceNow and Salesforce are smart to be adding that dimension. But it's going to be, I think, probably the great challenge of this era for CIOs, is getting their head around it.
Yeah, and I also appreciate that this article in interviewing people looked at everything from identity management to data platforms to cloud players, and realizing that agentic management is going to be a challenge across multiple layers, and asking basically vendors and executives at each of these layers, what problem do you see with agent management? And then everybody came up with a different problem.
Different. Yeah, there's
Yes.
all these layers. It's going to be a challenge. So, all right. Well, with that, we always try to end on a fun note, something light or at least ridiculous. And we actually don't have one this week. So I think we'll just end it like we always do and just say Elon Musk, and we'll call it a day.
Oh no. Although Tesla did not have a great day, and it's what he's doing is increasingly mysterious to all of us. All I know is he's still a very rich man. That's all I can tell you.
All right. Well, with that, I think we are at the end of another episode.
Yes, we are. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this and want to learn more, please like, subscribe, comment, and just let us know what you thought. Until next week, thank you so much for joining.